On October 29, 1998, a crowd gathered at Christie's auction house in New York for a very unusual sale. Usually, people come here to bid on beautiful paintings or royal jewelry, but that day, the object sitting on the display stand looked like it belonged in a trash can. It was a small, dusty book. It was black from fire, covered in mold, and the pages were glued shut. Honestly, it looked more like a piece of charcoal than a historical treasure. Experts in the room knew it was old, maybe from the 13th century, but it was in such terrible condition that it seemed almost worthless. Then, the bidding started. Price tags like $50,000, $100,000, and $500,000 were left in the dust. The room went silent as the number kept climbing. Finally, the hammer came down. An anonymous buyer, who we now only know as Mr. B, purchased that moldy piece of garbage for just over $2 million. $2 million for a book you wouldn't even want to touch without gloves. At the time, the world was confused. Why would anyone pay the price of a private island for something that looked like it had been pulled from a house fire? The answer is simple. Mr. B wasn't buying a book. He was buying a crime scene. Beneath those moldy pages and religious prayers was the evidence of a stolen future, a secret that had been buried for nearly 1,000 years. Some historians speculate that if that book had seen the light of day just a few hundred years earlier, the scientific history of our world might have accelerated significantly. We're talking about mathematical tools that make modern physics possible, ideas that were sitting in a junk pile the whole time. This is knowledge that traveled from ancient animal skin all the way to modern synthetic DNA. This is the story of the Archimedes Palimpsest, the book that was almost murdered by history. To understand what was in that book, we have to go back over 2,000 years to the year 212 BC. The city of Syracuse, which is in modern-day Italy, was under attack. The Roman army, the most powerful force on Earth, was outside the city walls with a massive fleet of ships. Usually, a city in this situation would be terrified, but Syracuse had a secret weapon. A 75-year-old man named Archimedes. Archimedes wasn't just a guy who liked math. He was basically the city's lead defense contractor. He had spent years building machines that seemed like something out of a science fiction movie. As the Roman ships got close, Archimedes unveiled his inventions. One of them was called the claw. It was exactly what it sounds like, a giant mechanical arm that would drop down, grab a Roman ship by the front, lift it straight out of the water, and then drop it to smash it against the rocks. The Romans were so scared, they started thinking they were fighting against ghosts or gods. But for Archimedes, it wasn't magic, it was just physics. You see, Archimedes had a very specific way of looking at the world. Most mathematicians back then only cared about perfect shapes on paper, but Archimedes loved tools. He loved levers, scales, and balances. In fact, he had a secret way of doing math that he called the method. Instead of just using logical steps, Archimedes treated mathematical shapes like they were physical objects. He would mentally place a circle on one side of a scale and a triangle on the other. He figured out the rules of geometry by seeing how they balanced against each other. Calculus, the math we use today to build rockets and understand the universe, was not born from long equations. It was born from balance. It showed that Archimedes had developed ideas astonishingly close to calculus nearly 2,000 years earlier. Archimedes knew this was a huge deal, but he also knew that other mathematicians of his time would think he was cheating by using physics to solve math problems. So he kept it a secret. He only wrote about it in one place, a letter to his friend in Alexandria.
That letter is what was hidden inside the moldy book sold in New York. But Archimedes never got to see his work travel the world. As the Romans finally broke into the city, they found him in his backyard. He wasn't hiding or fighting. He was sitting on the ground, drawing geometric circles in the sand. When a Roman soldier ordered him to come along, Archimedes didn't even look up. He just said, "Don't disturb my circles." Angered by his attitude, the soldier pulled out a sword and killed him right there. With that one swing of a sword, the smartest man in the world was gone. And his greatest secret, the foundation of modern science, was lost for the next 1,000 years.
A single sword strike, and 1,000 years of darkness fell upon mathematics. For about 1,000 years, Archimedes' work lived in a few rare copies scattered across the world. In the 10th century, a scribe in Constantinople, what we now call Istanbul, meticulously copied 7 of Archimedes' most important works into a single book. This book today is known as the Archimedes Codex. But as the centuries passed, the world changed. War, fire, and time wiped out most libraries. By the year 1229, one of the last copies of this codex ended up in the Mar Saba Monastery near Jerusalem. And this is where the story takes a weird turn. Inside that monastery was a monk named Johannes Myronis. He needed to write a new prayer book, but he had a problem. In his world, books were rarer and more expensive than gold. You couldn't just go to a store and buy a notebook. Paper existed elsewhere, but in that region, parchment was still far more common. Johannes looked around and found an old Greek book that seemed useless to him. To his eyes, it was just hundreds of pages of old math and physics from a dead culture. He wasn't trying to be a villain or destroy science. He was simply trying to save what mattered most to his time and his people. So, he did something that feels like a crime to us today. Johannes took the Archimedes Codex, cut the bindings, and washed the pages. He used acid and pumice, a type of rough volcanic rock, to scrape the original ink off the parchment. Then he took those large pages, folded them in half, rotated them 90 degrees, and wrote Christian prayers over the original mathematical text. Every amen he wrote was literally sitting on top of a 1,000-year-old secret. This process created what historians call a palimpsest, a document that has been erased and written over. But nature had a different plan.
The destruction became preservation. The very act of erasing the math is what saved it. For 7 centuries, the book sat in a library of a monastery, while the rest of the world unknowingly spent hundreds of years trying to reinvent the very math that was sitting in this book. In the 1840s, a researcher named Konstantin Tischendorf visited the monastery. He realized some of the pages were special, so he removed a single leaf, an act that was later widely criticized by scholars. That page is still sitting in a library at Cambridge University today. But the real breakthrough happened in 1906. A Danish scholar named Johann Ludwig Heiberg heard rumors about a Greek prayer book that had mathematical text underneath. He traveled to Istanbul, and with nothing but a magnifying glass, he managed to read the name Archimedes. Heiberg realized he was looking at a lost masterpiece. But before he could finish his work, the book disappeared again during a war. It didn't show up until the 1990s, the auction we talked about earlier. But by this time, the book was in a desperate state. It wasn't just ancient, it was scarred. By the late 19th century, mold was actively consuming the manuscript. This wasn't just a slow decay, it was a biological war.
Scientists weren't just studying history anymore, they were racing against the clock to save the book from total extinction. To make things even worse, someone had tried to improve the book back in 1938. A businessman had painted 4 religious images in liquid gold over the pages, thinking it would make the book more valuable at an auction. In reality, he had sealed the ancient math behind an impenetrable wall of metal. Regular cameras couldn't see through that gold. Traditional light couldn't penetrate it. So, in 2005, the team brought the book to the Stanford Linear Accelerator. This is a massive facility where they use high-energy particles to study the building blocks of matter. They used something called X-ray fluorescence. They fired a hair-thin beam of X-rays at the pages. Because the original ink contained iron, the beam made those iron atoms glow. By scanning the entire book atom by atom, the scientists were able to see through the prayers, through the gold paint, and through the mold. They recovered 95% of the original text. And that's when they realized something even more shocking. This wasn't just a lost book by Archimedes. As the images became clear, the team found text from other authors too, like lost speeches from an Athenian politician named Hyperides. We weren't just saving math, we were looking at texts that offer rare insight into Athenian political life. A particle accelerator built to understand the future of physics, used to rescue the past of mathematics. So, what did the recovered text actually tell us? First, and most importantly, it showed that Archimedes had developed the foundations of the math we now call calculus. For hundreds of years, we thought that Isaac Newton and Gottfried Leibniz invented calculus from scratch in the 1600s. But these pages show that Archimedes was using the exact same principles, like infinite series and integration, nearly 2,000 years earlier. But it wasn't just math on paper. Archimedes was doing something that looks a lot like what we do in modern computers. He didn't just calculate reality, he simulated it. By using his imagination and slicing shapes into infinite layers, he created the world's first mathematical simulations. It's the same logic used today in physics engines for video games and engineering software. Then there's the Stomachion puzzle. For a long time, people thought it was just a children's toy. But the palimpsest reveals that Archimedes was actually solving a complex problem in what we now call combinatorics. He was calculating the 17,152 different ways to arrange those 14 pieces into a square. Think about that for a second. Calculus was not invented once. Humanity discovered it twice. We cannot know for sure how history would have changed if this book hadn't been erased, but it is very likely that the mathematical tools for modern physics existed centuries before physics itself was even a field of study. This knowledge has traveled an incredible distance. It started on animal skin, was hidden in a prayer book, rescued by X-rays, and now, recently, digitized versions of ancient texts have even been experimentally stored in synthetic DNA. It has gone from the physical world to the digital world to the code of life itself. We cannot know for sure how history would have changed if this book hadn't been erased, but earlier access to these ideas might have accelerated scientific thinking, though technology depends on far more than mathematics alone. Humanity forgot its greatest invention for 1,000 years, and yet the universe's rules waited patiently for us to find them again. The story of the Archimedes Palimpsest reminds us that progress isn't a straight line, it's a fragile relay race. We often think that once something is discovered, it's known forever. But this book proves that the greatest threat to knowledge isn't fire or war. It's being forgotten. The most dangerous thing that can happen to an idea is for it to be ignored long enough that humanity has to spend 1,000 years trying to rediscover it. The ideas in this book survived. They survived acid, mold, fire, and gold. And now, for the second time in history, we can finally read them. Resonate with the algorithm, and I'll see you next time we dig through history's greatest secrets.